जा जा रे अपने मंदिरवा जा जा रे अपने
And welcome back. Now, in this kind of longish segment, we're going to take a look at some of the key features of early Buddhist thought, especially the discussions of karma and rebirth and liberation. Now, like the Upanishadic thinkers and the Jains, the Buddhists also kind of had a basic idea that, first of all, that there's rebirth, and that rebirth is caused by the lingering effects of your karma, your kamma, as it's called in Pali. All actions have consequences, and until all the actions that you've done have come to fruition, all their consequences have been resolved, you're basically still on the hook, and you have to continue to be within the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. There's a couple of differences, though, in how the Buddhists conceive of these things compared to the other schools of ancient Indian thought. First of all, the Buddhist kamma is not just any kind of action like it was for the Jains, but it's intentional action. It means deeds, words, or thoughts that are done because of some desire or craving, or from other emotional drives like anger, lust, fear, or some volition or conscious decision to do those actions. The nature of this intentionality, it's called cetana in Pali, is what makes an action good or bad. In the old Vedic scheme, if you remember, karma is good if it's prescribed by the rules of ritual or social rules. Karma is bad if it's not prescribed. For Buddhists, karma is bad if the intentions are bad, and it's good if the intentions are good. More interestingly, if there's no intention, then there's no karma at all. Now, understanding this little caveat is where the pathway to liberation begins, because ultimately we're asked to reconcile the idea of karma with two other concepts in Buddhism: the idea of anatta, no self, and the idea of anicca, impermanence. So, in other words, the idea is that how could it be that karma exists, but our souls don't exist, and the world itself is transitory, and so it doesn't really exist? This reconciliation is made through the essential and difficult to understand idea of dependent origination, pratitya samutpada, as it's called in Sanskrit. It's kind of a wild theory, if I'm being honest. Remember, even back then, it was hard for ordinary people to understand. It was so hard that the Buddha didn't really even feel like teaching the thing. So I don't know if we're going to do any better in understanding these ideas, but let's at least give it a shot if we can. Start with the idea of anatta, or no self, anatman in Sanskrit. This comes as basically like a direct rebuttal to what the Upanishads were saying. Remember, the Upanishads were concerned with investigating the real, permanent, undying nature of that kind of life force that animates you, your Atman, how we can free this Atman from the karmic bondage of your body and the cycle of death and rebirth. Instead, the Buddha is going to argue that there's actually no such thing as an Atman to be freed at all. It's not that we don't exist, we do exist, but the way we understand this existence is based on fundamentally false cognitions. Our perception of what our self is false. It's a result of the convergence of what the Buddha called the five skandhas, or aggregates. These are basically heaps of different kinds of material factors that come together to form our physical and conscious presence in the world. The five aggregates are our physical bodies, sensations, perceptions, impressions, and various means of discrimination. Because all these things converge at the same time and place and are kind of entirely entangled with each other, we feel that we exist as distinct individuals and that we have some kind of life force that feels permanent and it feels unique. But the aggregates are actually part of the huge natural material world, and even though they don't seem like it, they're momentary. Our bodies are going to wither and die. Our sensations are going to come and go. Our perceptions are always changing. Our memories fade, right? All of these aggregates are constantly in flux, and all of them perish and are dissolved when at the moment of your physical death. The only thing that persists, according to the Buddha's view, are the lingering effects of karma that puts the aggregates in kind of a motion vector, a vector that's now going to get transferred onto a new set of aggregates on the demise of the current set of aggregates that's your physical existence. Rebirth then is not any transmigration of some thing, some force of Atman, but it's a transference of that vector motion itself, the motion vector. It's a transference of karma from one aggregate to the next aggregate. If you need an analogy, think about maybe at a soccer game or a football game when there's a wave that starts in the stadium, right? People are just sitting down and standing up in sequence at the right time. But there's an illusion that there's a wave that's moving around in circles, right, in the stadium. Now, does the wave really exist? Well, looks like it exists, right? It looks like it's moving from like point A to point B. But in reality, nothing is moving from person to person, right? People are just sitting and standing at different times at the right time. That's exactly what's going on in the Buddhist understanding of the no self, anatta. The stadium is the material world, the people are these heaps of aggregates, and the wave is like our Atman, our soul, which feels like it moves from body to body. Right? The Atman, like the wave, feels like it exists, looks like it exists, but its existence is a false cognition. In reality, it's the karma that's moving. It's that vector, that directional vector that makes the wave seem like it exists. Right? The wave is real, we think, because our minds are clinging to the idea that the wave exists, just like we cling to the idea that our soul exists. Should mention that in later Buddhist traditions, actually, we do find the development of an Atman-like concept, where people are thought to have had a Buddha nature or Buddha dhatu within themselves, which ends up kind of functioning like a self. But it's in later Mahayana traditions that this Buddha nature stuff appears. It's not in the Buddha's own teachings, at least as we have them in the Pali Canon, where this no self idea seems to have been one of the key principles. Now, closely related to the idea of anatta is anicca, or impermanence of the world, anitya in Sanskrit. The idea here basically is that there's no such thing as the Brahman, right? No permanent force outside of nature that we can merge into or identify with or tap into to gain some kind of spiritual power. The Buddha argues that nothing at all is permanent, and so we must let go of the idea of a heaven, a permanent heaven, or a permanent Brahman that's outside of death and decay. Instead, all aspects of the material universe are subject to the forces of change, decay, transformation, death, rebirth, samsara. The Buddha argues that the pain and suffering that we feel is due to our failure really to accept or understand this impermanence, anicca, and especially of our own souls, our atmans. We pretend that things will not change, will not perish, and so we get really hurt or disappointed when they do. Instead, if we let go of the attachment to the idea of a permanent self or of a permanent infinite that's higher than the material world, the idea is that we'll be taking that step towards complete peace or nibbana. Now, this happens through a realization of both anicca and anatta, and this realization comes through maybe what's the hardest teaching of the Buddha for ordinary people to grasp, the idea of dependent origination, which is called pratitya samutpada in Sanskrit. This is a concept that's at the heart of the Buddha's explanation or theory of karma, of how transmigration works and how rebirth works, and ultimately how to escape it. Now, what is this kind of crazy theory all about? To put it simply, the basic idea of dependent origination is kind of a house of cards model, that there's an entity X which exists because other entities A, B, and C exist. Those entities exist because yet other entities exist, and so on and so forth until you get kind of a whole massive house of cards in which nothing truly exists on its own. This is the reasoning that the Buddha uses to explain how rebirth can occur, even though that there's no such thing as a permanent soul that goes from one body to another. To explain this idea, the Buddha identified a 12-step cycle that he called the 12 nidanas, or chain links, basically, of causation. This causal chain is what creates karma, which leads to your rebirth. And it's also responsible for the pain and suffering, the dukkha, that we all have to experience. Again, it's really hard to explain something so difficult in a YouTube video, so I don't think I'm going to try to do that in its entirety. But if you take a look at the 3 sites that you'll see highlighted in this causal chain of nidana links, you'll find sites where kamma is being generated, right? And it's this kamma is exactly what's kind of pushing the cycle of samsara forward. So for the Buddha, karma arises in the samskaras, or inclinations, that have already been kind of stamped into our minds from our previous lives. It's basically like a bank account of consequences that have already been imprinted in our present consciousness. Then there's an arising of craving or desire that results in new karma, since it provides the intent. These desires provide the intent that make our actions have karmic results. The third site where kamma is created in this causal chain is in this crucial stage of becoming, or bhava. In this stage, this is the stage that makes us invested in our own existence, and gives us a belief that we exist, and it makes us act in the world with intent and to be responsible for the consequences of those actions. This kind of investment in our existence, in our actions, and in their consequences then becomes a primal cause for future rebirth, and the whole cycle keeps on going. Right? The Buddha argued that you have to kind of break this causal chain in order to stop the cycle of karma and rebirth. Now, how would you do it? Well, that's their million-dollar question, and this is where the Buddha offers his million-dollar method. The million-dollar method he calls his Dhamma, his teachings, and that you could follow only if you first decide and declare that you're a Buddhist renunciant. Right? The foundation of the Dhamma is what are called the Satyas, the 4 noble truths, the Satyas in Sanskrit. These, I have to say, maybe are a bit more straightforward to understand than the Pratitya Samutpada 12-step process of dependent origination. First and foremost, the Buddha said that we have to accept the truth that dukkha, suffering, exists, along with aging, disease, death, no matter how hard we might try to avoid it or pretend like it's not going to happen to us or hope that it won't happen to us. You have to accept that it will happen. We'll all be hurting when it happens, when sorrow happens. You might be able to prolong your life for a while, avoid suffering, cloister yourself, but eventually death will still embrace you. You'll still experience pain and suffering somehow, somewhere. Here's where the Buddha maybe goes in a different direction from other spiritual teachers. Rather than trying to find a kind of permanent place free of suffering, he says you have to face the causes of suffering. And he points to one single important, critical, central cause that we already have seen in this 12-step cycle of dependent origination. The Buddha says that the real reason why we suffer is because we have a thirst, tanha, craving for things in the world. It can be a craving for things, literally, or it could be also a craving to avoid things, but it's still a craving, and it leads us to engage intentionally in actions in the world, doing things on purpose, right? Or even in mental thoughts, or even in your speech. We love someone, so we say it, we think it, we do something for that person. We hate someone, so we say it, or we think it, or we do something against that person. We avoid that person. It's that intentionality which derives from the attachments or cravings that we have, which then creates the karma that we suffer later. The Buddha posited a one-to-one causality between our cravings and our dukkha, saying that the way to end our dukkha, our suffering, is to eliminate our cravings or our attachments to things. This is the third noble truth that he proposes, called cessation or nirodha. Once our actions become de-intentionalized, then we don't have to experience their future consequences. If someone claps in the woods, right, does it make a sound if we're not there to hear it? Well, it will, unless we're able to let go of our attachment to the idea of listening itself. Right? Then we'll understand all sound to be false cognition, including that clap in the woods, whether it happens or not. So how does one achieve this kind of cessation, this divestment of intentionality, the ending of your cravings? This is the Buddha's biggest innovation, his key method that people can follow. While people like the Jains tried to do it through a kind of forcible attack on the physical body, the Buddha instead kind of preached what he called a noble eightfold path, the Arya Magga, which constituted the central teachings of his Dhamma, practical teachings of his Dhamma. First he said, one must renounce worldly life and become a monk or nun. It's a big first step to do. Then you have to learn how to follow 8 principles of everyday behavior: right conduct, speech, understanding, intention, action, effort, concentration, and mindfulness. This set of practices was a universal code for everyone in the monastic orders. And unlike the Brahminical law codes, it wasn't like different scripts that were for different castes and genders and life stages and so on. It was imagined as a single overarching set of moral principles to follow. It was Dharma with a capital D. Now, it's important to emphasize also that the Buddha initially developed this system for renunciants, right? Meaning you had to leave the ordinary world, this regular society, in order to gain liberation. You had to quit your day job. But eventually the Eightfold Path also becomes extended and modified to apply to the lay Buddhist community as well, kind of like what we saw with Jainism and the lay Jain community. So there's a social code of ethics that's created rather than a pathway to liberation for the lay Buddhist community. So it's through these ideas that the early Buddhists engaged with the questions of karma and samsara, suffering, death, and rebirth. The Buddha theorized karma in ways that were quite distinct, as we're kind of getting a sense of, from both the philosophy of the Brahminical Upanishadic thinkers, right, as well as what the Mahavira and the Jains had to say about it. What we're going to do in our next and final session of this first long leg of our journey through the ancient Indian past is to try to place all 3 of these philosophical schools in conversation with each other, and also bring in some Vedic and non-Vedic lines of thought that happen to be popular in the post-Vedic age, again, between 500, 300 BC, to see if we can get a kind of grand vision of that bustling marketplace of ideas that was ancient Indian religious culture, as we bring our long journey on this train of thought to maybe a final, satisfying halt. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.